Thank you for this introduction, Ceren. It's really nice to be here, first of all, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a good topic that you chose, and it's not one that gets a lot of recognition. So, for me, I briefly attended the protests, and so I can talk about it, even though I will not remember everything because it's been so long. However, there is a slogan that I remember quite well from the protests actually. Every day, I'm chapuling. And this was a reaction to Erdogan calling the protesters çapulcu, which in Turkish means looter or a worthless person. There were, of course, big hopes that the protest would lead to something big. I remember some groups even hoped that the government would resign as the protests grew bigger and bigger. However, I don't think that this was the initial intention behind this movement. Many of us were just happy to have a stage to show our discontent towards the government and show it to the rest of the world. You know, we were frustrated and needed ways to express our disappointment with the government. And we mainly used Twitter for that. I recall that actually in the first 2 days of the protest, I think at least 2 million tweets were sent out along with posts on multiple Facebook pages. One thing that really stood out the most for me was the adaptation of the general public to this. Did you know that actually there was an independent group of journalists? At the time, they developed a mobile application for Twitter to counter the misinformation done by the government on... let me check my notes. I have the name, it's 140 Journals. That was the name of the group. Oh, and there were also other independent pages on Facebook in other cities, but they were shut down by the government due to false accusations. I actually still consume the content of the 140 journals.
Thank you so much for sharing. Can you please tell us more about the aftermath of the protests? Have you noticed any notable changes with the government?
Let me start off by saying that protests almost never really have a lasting effect in Turkey. Even historically speaking, Ceren, we don't really have a democratic history. However, I can easily say that the AKP government has been becoming more and more authoritarian since the Gezi protests. So even the protest on its own represents the authoritarian nature of the Erdogan government, because all of the opposing views and opinions that basically threaten his authority are unwelcome. And we also saw this with the coup attempt in 2016. I'm one of those people that believe it was staged by Erdogan himself to solidify his authority and eliminate any threats that challenge his power. Currently speaking, I don't think the government will change its approach to not only protest but also democracy in general. Erdogan likes to portray this false impression that many of these protests and opposite views are imposed by foreign interventionists. For example, he has this discourse that the LGBTQ movements is actually a Western play to destroy the traditional Turkish family structure, and he suggested that after banning the Istanbul Pride, I believe in 2015. And we can relate this to the Gezi movement. To this day, the police, they use severely heavy force and they fence off all the areas where the parade takes place, and any attempts from the public are shut down. To him, the protesters were just another external threat. And reflecting back, I think the Gezi movement was an opportunity for him to justify his transition to authoritarianism.
Thank you. And could you expand a bit more on the aftermath?
Yes, absolutely, Ceren. After the Gezi Park protests, the government started putting very limiting measures, but little by little. And there were interventions in our lives, like internet censorship, we had abortion and alcohol restrictions. But the issue was actually much bigger. To put it simply, if you grew up in a secular, let's say, Kemalist environment, you were told that you were a second-class citizen and you had basically no rights in this country. It was a whole social issue, in my opinion. So let me give you an example. I was at a prestigious school back then, and a team similar to the AKP youth branch, they won the student council elections despite our school being in the top 3. On top of that, if we wanted to become civil servants, they would steal the exam questions and distribute them among AKP supporters. And sadly today we got used to these things happening, but back then my generation was very upset. So if you ask me about what this protest achieved in the end, I can say that they dropped the democratic mask of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and showed everyone that his intention was to establish a police-controlled state. It's a very complex issue.
Thank you so much for sharing. You really showed just how Erdogan government was not shaken by these protests, but rather used it to strengthen its authority with the manipulation of the media. In this podcast, we revealed an important fact. As activism continues to evolve and better itself, governments will continue to adapt even faster as a response. And movements fueled by digital activism often lack the foundations to fight back this force, as seen in the example of Taksim Park. In this podcast, we differentiate ourselves from the Ethiopian view, which argues that the internet, in fact, enables the emergence of a citizen-based, participatory democracy. And instead, we argued that this form of activism can in fact lead to digital divides, nation-state censorship laws, and lower impact of connectivity on social movements and change. So I would like to ask our listeners, what would activism look like in the 21st century if we remove digitization from it? And with that, we will wrap up today's episode. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay curious and remember technology shapes our world.